Hello everyone, my name is Forias and welcome to my channel. I'm sure you switched on the telly and you've heard politicians and economists talk about creating value and productivity. These are all buzzwords because the question is, what is value? Well, today we'll be explaining that in fact value is all about extraction and not about creation at all. If you're new here, this is a series of video essays where I cover political, economic, and revolutionary topics which are relevant to our time. I read the books, so you don't have to. In a world where money rules the land, there is one critique that is left unspoken. Integrity leads to innovation. Innovation leads to inequity. Inequity leads to insanity. Join me as we explore the four eyes of capitalism. Consider subscribing for more content in the future. Now, you'll probably listened to the podcast I do with Mr. E and heard me throwing around the word value. Well, you must be asking yourself, how is this important to economics? Well, it's critical. And this is the point of Mariana Mazzucato's book, The Value of Everything. In the world of economics, value makes or breaks how we function in society. Now, that's all a bit vague, so it's best to start at the beginning. And there's no better place to do that than to discuss how, in history, economists have tried to divide facets of society into productive and unproductive parts of the global economy. Let's start by talking about the labor theory of value and how it talked about objective analysis of what is productive within society. In any economics 101 class, they will state how integral Adam Smith was to the labor theory of value. After all, capitalism owes much of its ideas to Smith. For example, 1. That society should live in free markets where businesses are able to associate with who they choose. 2. That these businesses are competitive where they are on equal footing with other businesses within their industry. And 3. His concepts that would lead to businesses chasing the elusive goal of maximizing profit. With a little help from Milton Friedman, of course. Smith has become the figurehead of much modern economic theory because of his ideas about how capitalism is founded on supposedly immutable human behavior, notably self-interest and competition in a market economy. His metaphor of the invisible hand has been cited ad nauseum to support the current orthodoxy that markets, left to themselves, may lead to socially optimal outcomes, indeed more beneficial than if the state intervenes. Whilst that is all well and good, I want to focus on something far more interesting about the labor theory of value, that it wanted to objectively state how in society there were jobs and industries within Adam Smith's economy that he thought were beneficial and others that at best were necessary to administer or transfer value. He was convinced that growth depended on increasing the relative share of manufacturers, factories employing formerly independent artisans or agricultural workers as dependent wage laborers. In the overall makeup of industry, and believed that free trade was essential to bring that about. He felt that the enemies of growth were, first, the protectionist policies of the mercantiles, second, the guilds protecting artisans' privileges, and third, a nobility that squandered its money on unproductive labor and lavish consumption. Now, Adam Smith wasn't calling for his fellow economists to eat the rich. Well, unlike the philosopher Rousseau, of course. But he was calling for there to be a boundary of the different industries and professions within the economy. This is an important part of the history that people forget about when it comes to economists before Smith and his contemporaries, the classical economists. For Adam Smith, productive labor within the economy was organized in material production. So, for example, agriculture, manufacturing, and mining. Whereas, as mentioned before, immaterial production, may have been integral, such as a lawyer who coded the rights of who owned the means of production, but their services didn't create value, that is, commodities in the economy. To drive this point home, we will discuss the work of Karl Marx that similarly talked about productive and unproductive industries within society. The topic of Marx's theories deserve their own video essay. Trust me, all 3 volumes of Das Kapital would have made Hermione Granger blush. But what Marx added to the theory of value was the idea of the importance of workers' labour, the working day, and surplus value. Workers expend labour, not labour power, and in this distinction lies the secret of Marx's theory of value. Humans can create more value than they need to restore their labour power. For instance, if a worker has to work 5 hours to produce the value needed to restore labour power per day, the labour power's value is equivalent to the 5 hours of work. However, if the working day lasts 10 hours, the additional 5 hours work will create value over and above that needed to restore labour power. Labour power creates surplus value. The ingenuity of capitalism, according to Marx, is that it can organize production to make workers generate unprecedented amounts of this surplus value. In other words, the average worker knows that they must work in order to subsist in the world. This inevitably is variable capital to the business owner or capitalist. They make an agreement with the worker to give them a wage for their work on commodities within the business. Compared to Adam Smith, Marx had a different idea of what was productive and unproductive in society. The production sphere, the lighter blob, includes 3 basic sectors: primary, comprising essential material such as food and minerals; secondary, which is the industry, the basis of value creation in Smith and Ricardo; and tertiary, the services considered by Smith to be immaterial. The darker blob within, called the circulation sphere, reflects Marx's analysis, which we will discuss later, that some aspects of finance are essential to production and deserve to be placed on that side of the production boundary. On the other side of the boundary, Marx followed Smith and Ricardo in regarding government and households as unproductive. Whilst on the whole, he agreed with Smith that it was manufacturing that created the majority of production, tertiary and the ability to circulate surplus value of capital was important within capitalism. This is where we get the money to commodity to money aspect of Marx's work. What both of these theorists point out is they thought there were parts of society, parts of the economy, that objectively create and extract value within the society. Capitalists in their time during the Industrial Revolution were producing commodities and raising economics of scale that were previously unheard of and were seemingly improving society. Landlords and governments who contributed to the wealth of leisure classes were less so. But this is where things get interesting, because the age of normative value of production would not last. Suddenly, we have the marginalist economists who, instead of focusing on objective ideas of what is productive and unproductive, we get the introduction of subjective value. Enlightenment thinkers imagined a society where the pursuit of individual interests could be aligned with the social good by means of laws and moral education. It was embraced by neoclassical economics, which took up the study of means, while explicitly refusing to distinguish between ends, and then by the type of managerial thinking that has permeated so many aspects of our daily lives. The maximization itself soon became the point. What emerged was a society of means focused on the how over the what. In steps Alfred Marshall, and the marginal utilitarians. Before this, capital and finance was seen as an integral but an unproductive force within economics. What the marginalists achieved was convincing the world that not only was economics a science rather than a social science, but that viewing commodities' value as subjective was important for markets. And he achieved this with one word: scarcity. In many respects, Marshall was a natural heir to the classical tradition. He accepted that the cost of production was important in determining a commodity's value. But he and his followers shifted thinking about value from the study of broad quantities of capital, labor, and technology inputs, and their returns to that of small incremental quantities. Using mathematical calculus, they focused on how a small or marginal change in one variable causes a change in another. So, what was the new theory, marginalism, about? First, it is based on the notions of utility and scarcity and is subjective. The value of things is measured by their usefulness to the consumer. Second, this utility decreases as the amount of a thing that is held or consumed increases. The first Mars bar you eat in a day may provide a lot of utility or satisfaction, and even happiness. It is enjoyable and maybe starves off hunger pangs. But as you go on eating Mars bars, they cease to be enjoyable and even make you feel ill. In other words, the laws of diminishing returns and neoclassical theory are born. From here, it's not surprising we get the idea of supply and demand. Again, instead of a normative measure where we can keep track of the wealth of nations, as Adam Smith puts it, we get a subjective commodity world where a vicious cycle of price dictating the value of a commodity and the value dictating the price. The marginal revolutionaries, as they have been called, used marginal utility and scarcity to determine prices and the size of the market. In their view, the supply and demand of scarce resources regulates value expressed in money. But what this model gains in versatility, the notion that the preference of millions of individuals determining prices and hence value, it loses in the ability, or rather lack of ability, to measure what Smith called the wealth of nations, the total production of an economy in terms of value. Marginal utility and scarcity need a couple of additional assumptions for price determining on to work as intended. First, all humans have to be one-dimensional utility calculators who know what's best for themselves, what price to pay for and what commodity, and how to make an economically rational choice. Second, there must be no interference, for example, by monopolies, in price setting, equilibrium with perfect competition. Taking the utilitarian assumptions into consideration, I should be able to go to the supermarket and walk to the shampoo section and look at 20 options, if it's a small store, that is, and have the rational capacity to not only get the best deal, despite there being a variety of prices, quality, and marketing of these brands. I'm sure there isn't any data out there that refutes people being the sort of rational calculators that neoclassicals assume. But all jokes aside, I hope you can see how cracks in the economic framework start to appear. Not only that neoclassical economics released finance from its circulation role under classical economics, such as Karl Marx's Das Kapital, but if price dictates value and value dictates price, finance is suddenly in a great position to manipulate both sides of the equation. Take the 2008 global financial crisis as an example. Policymakers' faith in the value of finance was undiminished by its 2008 implosion. Instead, their reaction to the global financial crisis was to insist that more of each economy's capital should be assigned to private sector banks and to support them with an ultra-relaxed monetary policy, in which near-zero interest rates were supplemented by central banks buying up of government or even corporate bonds to keep their prices high. This massively increased the asset side of the world's main central banks. Countries aspiring to achieve US levels of prosperity have long been advised, especially by their multilateral creditors, to make financial deepening, the expansion and deregulation of banks and financial markets, a central part of their development strategy. Most people would think that you were mad if your solution to getting out of a hole was to dig deeper underground. But that's exactly what central banks and those stemming of the neoclassical tradition advised. One explanation would be neoliberalism. Check out the last video essay if you haven't. But what Mazzucato asked the reader is to ask why the economy is digging that deeper hole. Why is it dying on the hill of speculation in markets? It's because price dictating value and value dictating price promotes extracting value, unlike the classical economists who tried to establish what creates value. The banking problem arose because as the 20th century progressed, banks' role in fueling economic development steadily diminished in theory and practice. While their success in generating revenue and profit through operations paid for by households, firms, and government steadily increased. Instead today, if we use the value-added formula, wages plus profit, we find that the financial sector, far from contributing 7.2% of GDP to the UK economy and 7.3% to the US, as the 2016 National Accounts showed, in fact makes a contribution to output that is zero or even negative. By this yardstick, it is profoundly fundamentally unproductive to society. Ask any statistician, you play a dangerous game of diminishing the value of your graphs if you mess with the numbers and figures. The neoclassical way of looking at banks has marketed them in a positive light. Sure, they've been able to push around money for loans and deposits. But the question is, are they really creating value? Banking, it is argued, provides three main services: maturity transformation, the conversion of short-term deposits into mortgages and business loans, liquidity, the instant availability of cash through a short-term loan or overdraft for businesses and households that need to pay for something, and perhaps most importantly, credit assessments, vetting loan applications to decide who is creditworthy and what the terms of the loan should be. This bundle of services collectively constitutes financial intermediation. It is assumed that instead of directly charging for these services, banks impose an indirect charge by lending at higher interest rates than they borrow at. The cost of financial intermediation services, indirectly measured, FISM, is calculated by the extent to which banks can mark up their customers' borrowing rates over the lowest available interest rate. National statisticians assume a reference rate of interest that borrowers and lenders would be happy to pay and receive, the pure cost of borrowing. They measure FISM as the extent to which banks can push lenders' rates below and or borrowers' rates above this reference rate, multiplied by the outstanding stock of loans. In other words, the banks are incentivized to tamper with the interest rates. It's a classic case of who watches the watchers or who guards the guards. It's this sort of scenario that leads to a slippery slope, like casino capitalism, and incentives behind the innovation economy. But that's a topic for another day. If you haven't already, like, share, and subscribe for more content in the future. And remember, folks, to keep thinking and keep learning. Goodbye till next time.